By the mid-1980s, the Gambino crime family was considered the most powerful mafia family in America. It had money, influence, territory, and a reputation built over decades. But beneath the surface, the family was divided. On one side stood Paul Castellano, the official boss, a man who represented business, industry, construction, unions, and white-collar power. On the other side stood a street faction built around older loyalties, neighborhood crews, and men who believed the family was drifting away from the people who had built it. This is not simply the story of John Gotti. This is the story of the Gambino family itself, a family with two power centers, a succession crisis, a divided leadership, and a coup that changed the New York Mafia forever. To understand the Gambino coup, you have to begin with Carlo Gambino. Carlo was not the loudest boss. He was not the flashiest. He did not behave like a celebrity. He was quiet, cautious, and political. Under his leadership, the Gambino family became one of the richest and most stable criminal organizations in America. The family had influence in construction, trucking, unions, garment businesses, gambling, loan sharking, and waterfront rackets. But Gambino's real genius was balance. He understood that a mafia family was not one united block. It was a collection of captains, crews, earners, old friendships, neighborhood loyalties, and ambitious men who all wanted influence. A weaker boss ruled through fear. Carlo ruled through patience. He kept powerful men satisfied without allowing any one faction to become strong enough to challenge him. But by the 1970s, Gambino was aging. His health was declining, and the family had to face the question that destroys many powerful organizations. Who comes next? Many people inside the family believed the answer was obvious. Aniello Dellacroce. Known simply as Neil, he was the Gambino family underboss. But that title does not fully explain his importance. Neil was respected by the street crews. He had deep ties to the old school side of the family, especially crews operating out of Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. He was feared, but he was also trusted. To many soldiers and captains, he represented the traditional mafia world. Social clubs, street rackets, personal loyalty, discipline, face-to-face respect. He was the kind of leader men followed because they believed he understood them. If a soldier had a problem, Neil was someone who could settle it. If a captain needed political protection, Neil's support mattered. If a young gangster wanted to rise, Neil's approval could open doors. For the street faction, he looked like the natural heir. But Carlo did not choose him. Instead, he chose Paul Castellano. And that decision planted the seed of everything that followed. Paul Castellano was not weak. That is one of the biggest misunderstandings about this story. Because John Gotti later overthrew him, people sometimes imagine Castellano as a soft boss who did not understand power. That is not true. Paul was powerful in a different way. He was a businessman. He understood construction, food distribution, unions, concrete, and legitimate companies that could be influenced or controlled from behind the scenes. While many captains were still thinking in terms of gambling dens, hijacked trucks, and street collections, Castellano was thinking bigger. He believed the future of the mafia was not in street crime. It was in industries, construction projects, concrete contracts, labor peace, corporate influence. Carlo likely saw that. To him, Paul represented the future, quieter, richer, and less visible. That was the logic. But logic and loyalty are not always the same thing. To many street-level members, Paul felt distant. He lived in a mansion on Tot Hill in Staten Island. He held meetings away from the old neighborhoods. He did not spend much time in the clubs where soldiers and captains built trust. So when Big Paul became boss in 1976, the Gambino family did not immediately explode, but it did split emotionally. Officially, Castellano ruled the family. Unofficially, many men still looked to Dellacroce. The Gambino family now had two centers of power. After Castellano took power, the Gambino family entered a strange arrangement. There was the administration around Castellano, tied closely to business rackets and high-level earning. Then there was the street faction around Neil, tied to traditional crews and neighborhood power. These were not official political parties. Nobody called them that. But that is how power often worked. Castellano's side included men who benefited from business rackets and who were comfortable with his corporate-style leadership. Men like Thomas Gambino, Paul's relative, were closely associated with the family's more business-oriented interests. Paul also relied heavily on Thomas Bellotti, a loyal Staten Island figure who eventually became his underboss. But Bilotti was not widely respected in the same way Neil had been. To many street figures, Bilotti looked less like a political bridge and more like Castellano tightening his own circle. On the other side were men tied to Dellacroce's world. John Gotti, operating out of Ozone Park, Queens; Angelo Ruggiero, Gotti's close friend and crew member; Gene Gotti, John's brother; Frank DeCicco, a respected Gambino figure with important connections; Joseph Piney Armone, an older and respected captain whose support carried weight; Sammy Gravano, then connected to Brooklyn Power Networks and later one of the most important men in the New Order. These men did not all hold the same rank and they did not all have the same motives, but they understood one thing. If Castellano completely reshaped the family after Dellacroce's death, their influence could shrink overnight. That is how power works inside any organization. Sometimes a promotion is not just a promotion. Sometimes it is a warning. This is the part most mafia stories rush past. The Gambino family was not divided because one side liked crime and the other side liked business. It was divided because different groups believed the family's future should belong to different kinds of men. Castellano represented wealth without visibility. Dellacroce represented loyalty from the streets. As long as Dellacroce lived, he held the street faction in place. He gave them dignity, influence, and a sense that they were still represented at the top. But if Dellacroce disappeared, Castellano would no longer need to balance the family in the same way. That was the fear. And in politics, fear often matters more than fact. John Gotti was not born into power. He rose through the street. His base was Ozone Park, Queens, especially the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, which became one of the most famous mafia social clubs in New York. But Gotti's importance came from more than personality. He was tied to Dellacroce. That mattered. Neil's protection gave Gotti room to grow. It also connected him to a larger faction inside the Gambino family that respected the old underboss more than Castellano. Gotti's crew was known for street rackets, gambling, loan sharking, hijacking, and narcotics-related controversy. That last issue became especially dangerous because Castellano had a strict public opposition to drug trafficking. By the early 1980s, federal investigations and wiretaps involving Angelo Ruggiero and Gene Gotti created a serious problem. Castellano wanted to know what was on the tapes. Ruggiero resisted. Gotti feared that if Castellano obtained the recordings, his crew could be broken apart, demoted, or worse. This was not just personal resentment anymore. It was survival. On December 2nd, 1985, Aniello Dellacroce died. For the Gambino family, this was more than the death of an underboss. It was the collapse of the bridge between two worlds. Dellacroce had kept the street faction loyal. He had prevented resentment from becoming rebellion. He had accepted Castellano's leadership, and because he accepted it, others followed. But now he was gone. Then Castellano made what many saw as a serious political mistake. He did not attend Dellacroce's wake. Whether Castellano had personal reasons, legal concerns, or simply underestimated the symbolism, the effect was devastating. To Dellacroce's loyalists, it looked like disrespect. In organizations built on honor, perception can be fatal. Then came another move. Castellano elevated Thomas Bilotti as underboss. Bilotti was loyal to Castellano, but he did not have Dellacroce's standing with the street crews. To Castellano, Bilotti may have looked dependable. To others, his rise looked like Castellano replacing the old balance with a personal loyalist. That was the moment many men began to believe the future was closing in on them. The Castellano assassination was not simply one ambitious captain deciding to kill a boss. It required support, or at least acceptance, from enough influential men to prevent immediate retaliation. That is what made it a coup. John Gotti was central, but he was not alone. Frank DeCicco was crucial. DeCicco was respected, politically connected, and trusted by different sides of the family. His support helped make the move seem less like one reckless crew acting alone and more like a broader internal shift. Sammy Gravano later described discussions in which he and DeCicco worried about the family's future under Castellano's chosen circle, especially if Thomas Bilotti and other Castellano loyalists gained greater control. Joseph Piney Armone also mattered. Armone was an older captain with credibility. His support helped reassure others that the move was not merely a young faction grabbing power. Angelo Ruggiero and Jean Gotti had personal reasons to fear Castellano's discipline because of the wiretap issue. This is how coups work. One man may become the face of it, but the real power comes from coalition. A captain here, a respected elder there, a crew with something to lose, a loyalist who feels overlooked, a group of men who decide that the current leadership threatens their future more than rebellion does. By December 1985, that coalition was ready. A mafia boss could not survive on title alone. He needed captains to accept his authority. If too many captains turned against him, his position became fragile. This is why men like DeCicco and Armone mattered so much. They gave political weight to the conspiracy. Without them, Gotti's move might have looked like one crew acting recklessly. With them, it looked like a faction of the family making a decision about leadership. That distinction mattered, because after Castellano died, the family would have to decide whether to reject the coup or accept it as the new reality. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano arrived in Midtown Manhattan for a meeting at Sparks Steakhouse. With him was Thomas Bellotti, his newly elevated underboss and loyal protector. Castellano believed he was arriving for business, but the political decision had already been made. Outside the restaurant, gunmen waited. Gotti and Gravano watched from nearby. Within moments of Castellano stepping from the car, shots rang out. Paul Castellano was killed. Thomas Bellotti was killed beside him. The most powerful mafia boss in America was dead on a Manhattan street. But this was not only an assassination, it was regime change. One wing of the Gambino family had removed another. After Castellano's death, the question was immediate. Would the family accept the new leadership? A temporary committee was formed, but the reality was clear. John Gotti was the dominant figure. In January 1986, Gotti was formally recognized by Gambino captains as boss. But now he faced the same problem every new ruler faces after a coup. He had to reward supporters without alienating the rest of the organization. Frank DeCicco became underboss. This made sense. DeCicco had helped make the coup possible, and he carried enough respect to stabilize the new administration. Joseph Armone became consigliere. Again, this was political. Armone's age, reputation, and old-school credibility helped reassure parts of the family that the new regime was not simply a reckless takeover by one queen's crew. Sammy Gravano rose rapidly after the coup, eventually becoming one of the most powerful men in the family. These promotions rewarded loyalty, but they also sent a message. The men who backed the new order would rise. The men tied to the old order would have to adjust. Some did, others quietly resented it. That is the danger of every coup. Winning power is one thing. Governing afterward is another. Not everyone inside the Gambino family had wanted Castellano gone. Some men were tied to him by business, loyalty, or simple self-interest. Thomas Gambino, Castellano's relative, represented the family's quieter business wing. James Faya, a powerful captain connected to trucking and labor rackets, was considered close to Castellano's side of the family. Daniel Marino, another significant figure, had his own power base and was not simply part of Gotti's inner circle. The Gambino family was too large for everyone to be on one side. But after Sparks, survival required calculation. Openly challenging Gotti was dangerous. Accepting him was practical. Many Castellano-era figures remained inside the family and adjusted to the new reality. That is important because it shows the coup did not create a clean civil war inside the Gambinos. Instead, it created a colder kind of politics. Some men accepted the new administration because it was safer. Some accepted it because the commission did not immediately remove Gotti. Some accepted it because money still had to be made. But acceptance is not the same as loyalty. And beneath the surface, the assassination had broken a rule that other mafia leaders took very seriously. The murder of Paul Castellano created a problem beyond the Gambino family. Traditionally, killing a boss required approval from the commission. That rule existed for a reason. If any ambitious captain could murder his boss and take over, then no boss in New York was safe. The commission was designed to prevent exactly that kind of chaos. Gotti had ignored the process. That angered powerful figures in other families, especially men who believed Castellano's murder threatened the entire system. Gigante of the Genovese family was one of the most important figures who opposed Gotti's rise. Anthony Tony Dux Corallo of the Lucchese family also belonged to the old world of commission authority. To them, Gotti was not simply a new boss. He was a dangerous precedent. If his coup succeeded without punishment, every captain in New York would learn the same lesson. Power could be taken in the street, and that could not be allowed. On April 13th, 1986, Frank DeCicco was killed by a car bomb in Brooklyn. The attack was intended as retaliation for the murder of Castellano and Bellotti. Gotti was reportedly also a target, but he was not there when the bomb exploded. DeCicco's death was as a message. The commission world had not forgotten. The old bosses could not allow the Castellano assassination to pass without consequence. But the use of a bomb was shocking. American Mafia tradition generally avoided explosives because they were too public, too unpredictable, and too likely to harm innocent people. That made DeCicco's killing feel even more dramatic. The coup had succeeded inside the Gambino family, but outside the family, the political cost was still unfolding. The Gambino coup worked because Gotti and his allies understood timing. Carlo Gambino was gone. Dellacroce was dead. Castellano was under legal pressure. Bellotti lacked broad respect. The wiretap issue threatened Gotti's circle. Street crews felt ignored. Business factions were powerful but not universally loved, and enough important men believed their future would be safer under a new administration. That is why this moment matters. It was not only ambition, it was timing, perception, fear, and coalition building. The assassination at Sparks Steakhouse was the visible event. But the coup had been forming long before the first shot was fired. Short term, the coup made John Gotti boss. Long term, it weakened the Gambino family. Gotti became famous. Too famous. He attracted cameras, reporters, surveillance, and pressure. The FBI and NYPD increased their focus. Wiretaps captured conversations. Prosecutors built stronger cases. Most importantly, the same politics that brought Gotti to power eventually helped bring him down. Sammy Gravano, one of the men rewarded by the new administration, later became a government witness. The trusted insider became the destroyer. That is the irony. Gotti rose because he understood loyalty. He fell because loyalty broke. In 1992, Gotti was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The coup had given him the throne, but it also placed him directly in the spotlight. And for a mafia boss, the spotlight is poison. The Gambino coup is often told as a story about John Gotti, but that misses the deeper lesson. This was a succession crisis, a leadership split, a fight between business power and street power, a moment where captains, crews, and factions had to decide which future they believed in. Paul Castellano believed the family's future was quiet, corporate, and controlled from above. The street faction believed power still had to be respected from below. For almost 10 years, Aniello Dellacroce kept those worlds from colliding. When he died, the balance died with him. And 2 weeks later, Paul Castellano was dead too. The murder of Paul Castellano did not simply change the Gambino family. It changed how every mafia boss looked at his own captains. Because after 1985, the lesson was clear. The greatest threat to a boss might not come from another family. It might come from the men sitting inside his own. In the next chapter of Inside the Mafia, we leave the Gambinos and enter a family where internal politics did not end in one assassination. It became a war. The Colombo family split in two. Persico loyalists against Orina loyalists, boss against acting boss, crew against crew. And the result was one of the bloodiest internal conflicts in modern mafia history.